Well, welcome to everyone. My name is Jerry Caprio. I'm a professor of economics and chair of the Center for Development Economics. It's my great pleasure to introduce Joe Stiglitz, our speaker, to you tonight. Joe is a university professor at Columbia University. He's the co-founder and co-president of the Institute for Policy Dialogue at Columbia, the chair of the Management Board and Director of Graduate Summer Programs at the Brooks World Poverty Institute. His previous positions include, and I can't give them all to you, as you'll hear why in a minute, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist at the World Bank, and before that, Chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the U.S. from 1995 to 1997. Joe's taught at Princeton, Oxford, Stanford, Yale, many other illustrious universities. He's been a winner of the John Bates Clark Medal to the top economist under 40, only a few years ago, clearly. He also won this Nobel Prize in 2001 that you may have heard of. He's won more honors and honorary degrees than the number of master's students that Williams gives out, number of master's degrees that Williams gives out over any 5-year period. Not to mention consulted with more governments and other organizations, given more invited lectures, edited more journals, or served on more advisory committees than most economics departments combined, except those, of course, that have had Joe as a member. I could introduce him by saying that Joe's written numerous articles. That would be like saying that in the financial crisis, some banks made a few bad loans. If you care about the environment, please do not print out his CV. It was, and I emphasize was, 58 pages, but that was yesterday. I'm sure it's longer now. He's published over 650 articles, again as of yesterday, not to mention over 50 books, or over 100 other working papers. Economists are very fond of looking at the citation counts that economists achieve. In fact, I saw a good one today. It was about analyzing citation accounts, so it was so that economists could be cited yet again by writing about citations. This is a depressing thought for the economists in the audience. Google Scholar records 39,000 citations of his work. Again, few departments in major universities have that number. If Joe's impact on the profession were merely proportionate to his output, it would be phenomenal, but it's even more impressive in my view. It's said that his graduate school advisor, Paul Samuelson, considered by many to be one of the greatest economists of all times, could only spare one sentence for Joe's recommendation letter, and that sentence said, "All you need to know about Joe Stiglitz is that he's the best economist to ever come out of Gary, Indiana." That sent economists in departments around the U.S. looking for who else came from Gary, Indiana, and of course it was Paul Samuelson himself. It would not have been surprising if economics departments around the world had not become heavy consumers of bottled water from Gary, Indiana, otherwise noted for its steel production. Joe's one of the few economists like Samuelson who could have been awarded the Nobel Prize in many different areas. Because if you do look at that CV, again, please don't print it, he's made impressive contributions in economic development, in financial economics, in public and welfare economics, macro, international economics, and I could go on. Suffice it to say that economists are very happy with the practice of the Nobel Committee not to award the prize more than once to the same individual. I enjoyed working at the World Bank with Joe when he was the chief economist there, and I remember at his going away party when people were wondering about his decision to go to New York versus the West Coast, and my remark at the time to him was that it was good he was going to New York because then when the call came from Stockholm, it wouldn't be quite so early in the morning. If all this weren't enough, Joe combines his clearly prodigious analytical skills with a willingness, and I think it's fair to say a certain zest, for taking on powerful interests. as, for example, he took on the U.S. Treasury and the International Monetary Fund for the prescriptions that were being made during the East Asian crisis. Prescriptions, I might add, that the U.S. itself didn't follow in its own crisis, as we'll discuss at tomorrow's panel session. That makes him a natural ally of the CDE, where one of the goals is to improve policymaking in developing countries by trying to communicate the critical thinking skills that are necessary to really analyze and make good policies. Joe himself has taken on the conventional wisdom in so many cases. Just a few recent examples, his books on the cost of the Iraq War, in which he forced everyone to recognize the total costs of the war, including the debilitating physical and mental health aspects that would linger. Free Fall, his insightful analysis of the recent financial crisis, which he foreshadowed in his writings as early as the early 2000s, if not before. And I guess most recently, his book with Amartya Sen and Jean-Paul Fitoussi, Mismeasuring Our Lives, Why GDP Doesn't Add Up, a theme that actually was related to the discussions this morning with Henry Bruton. I'm happy to announce that you're going to have more than one chance to hear Joe, along with Rob Johnson, who's here and is head of the Institute for New Economic Thinking. They'll both be speaking at 12:30 tomorrow in Griffin Hall, room 3, on some of the issues related to the crisis and why economics does need some new thinking. Now, lastly, I shouldn't omit that notwithstanding all his achievements, Joe did actually have to overcome a couple of hurdles. I'm not referring to growing up in Gary, Indiana, which apparently there may be something in the water that really is good there to drink, but rather the serious disadvantage that Joe overcame, of course, was attending another small liberal arts college in Massachusetts. I guess inspired by the Harry Potter series, I guess we should call it the school that should not be named. I'll only say that in this town it's better known for its losses on the sporting field to Williams teams. More seriously, as we celebrate the 50th anniversary of the CDE, an institution that through its alumni has made important contributions to economic advice and policymaking in developing countries, and has provided a way for Williams undergraduates to get to interact with these current and future stars in their government. Nothing could be more appropriate than to have one of the foremost economists of our time, let alone the best economist to ever come out of Gary, Indiana, here to talk to us about a half century of development thinking. Joe.
Well, thank you, Jerry, for that wonderful introduction. And it's a real pleasure to be here to help celebrate CD's 50th anniversary. It's also a real pleasure to be here before a distinguished audience, which has shown the influence of CDE, an audience which includes prime ministers, central bank governors, and future prime ministers and central bank governors, finance ministers, and people working in other aspects of government policy. I really do think CDE has made an important contribution to the development to developing countries. I happen to be in the ideas business. I do believe that ideas matter. It's a theme I'll come back to at the end. And colleges, universities play a very important role in shaping ideas. Something I'll talk with Rob Johnson tomorrow is that the problems in the United States and much of the rest of the world were very much shaped by mistaken ideas about deregulation, a kind of set of perspectives that were sold as good economics, but in fact were not. And CDE has long been engaged in trying to open up people's mind to question. And I think that's the essential feature of liberal arts colleges, whether they're on this side of Massachusetts or in the middle of Massachusetts. That I think this is the real contribution of a liberal arts education, to question, to doubt, and to have people think about economic ideas and the impacts that economic policies have on the citizens of the country. That when economic ideas get implemented, it's just not statistics, it's not just the unemployment rate, it's people's lives that are being affected. And that's often forgotten. What I want to do, in a way, is a celebration of the 50th anniversary of CDE, is to talk a little bit about what's happened to development economics over the last 50 years. And it's been a remarkable half-century, both for Williams, for CDE, and for the development economics. 50 years ago, it was almost inconceivable that development, the successes of development that have occurred, it was beyond the dream. Some countries were growing, but growth was very slow. In the 60s, Gernot Myrdal went to Asia, and he wrote a very powerful book in which he explained why it was that Asia was going to inevitably remain mired in the poverty in which they had been for millennia. That was really a very pessimistic note. Of course, the timing, his timing was like the timing of so many economists, absolutely dismal. Because as he was writing this book about the impossibility of development in Asia, it was already taking off. And what we've seen in the last 50 years have been successes, as I say, beyond anything that anybody could have dreamed. The growth in East Asia particularly, increases in per capita income of 8-fold. India was growing very slowly, something that came to be called the Hindu rate of growth. But then all of a sudden, the last 25 years, it's been growing at 5 and 6%. And then in the last 10 years, it's been growing at 8 and 9%. In addition to all these successes, is the way that many of the developing countries have responded to the last crisis, a crisis that has a Made in USA label on it. Maybe not the proudest output of the United States, but export from the United States. But while we are having a great deal of trouble recovering from our crisis, putting together good policies to respond to the crisis, China has done exactly what we teach them countries ought to do in the face of an economic downturn. They actually took some of our ideas seriously. And they did the same thing in the crisis of 1997. I described them at the time as the A-plus student of American economics. And what they did is had a very strong stimulus package, and the result of that strong stimulus package is that they've been growing at 9-10%. And that's true not only of China, but growth has been very strong in Africa, in the crisis, Latin America, India, East Asia more generally. But while there have been these successes, as I say, successes that were beyond anything that one could have anticipated when CDE was started, there have also been some failures. The failures have been most notable in Africa, where when I first went there, not quite 50 years ago in 1969, right after many of the countries had become independent, end of colonialism, there was really the hope that with throwing off the shackles of colonialism, they would begin to grow. It was a period of enormous optimism. And yet, the subcontinent did not grow. Conflict and in fact, poverty increased. And the contrast between the reduction in poverty, I should have mentioned this, that not only was there very rapid growth in East Asia, including in China, but there were enormous reductions in poverty. In the case of China, for instance, more, depending on how you measure it, more, and I'll come back to that, more than 400 million people were moved out of poverty, the largest reduction in poverty ever. Even between 1990 and 2005, the reduction in poverty was, according to the standard statistics, went from 673 million down to 207 million. So that in the space of just 15 years, more than 450 million Chinese went out of poverty. While there are these successes in growth and shared growth in the sense that poverty went down, in Africa, the number of people living under $1.25 a day actually went from just short of 300 million in 1990 to 388 million in 2005. So that the likelihood of meeting the Millennium Development Goals, the goal of reducing poverty by half from 1990 to from the year 2000 to 2015 is actually not, almost surely will not be achieved. Well, that raises some really interesting questions. What accounts for the enormous successes in the countries that have been successful? And it's not just in Asia. Botswana has been one of the, a small country in Africa has been one of the other very successful cases. What accounts for the successes and what accounts for the failure? From an analytic point of view, from the point of view of a social science, this is a wealth of data, a wealth of experience from which we can try to make inferences of what to do and what not to do. But like in so many areas, the world is very complex, and making the right inferences is extraordinarily difficult. Some of the big lessons, and these are the following. One is that growth is necessary, but it's not sufficient for long-term poverty reduction. Trickle-down economics doesn't work. Of course, we should have known that from the United States, and we're getting every day a lesson in that. A couple of weeks ago, the new numbers of what has been happening in the United States came out, showing that poverty is up, but it's not just poverty is up. Median income, people in the middle class, the most recent data show that median income in the United States in 2009, the most recent data that was just released, is actually lower than it was in 1997, 12 years earlier. So for most Americans, there has been no growth for 12 years. GDP has increased. GDP per capita has increased. But all of the benefits have gone to the people at the top. And that, of course, the fact that the people in the middle are not doing very well is even worse for the people at the bottom. So that raises a broad set of issues that I'm going to come back to at the end. If growth isn't enough, what is necessary if we're going to reduce poverty? So the last 50 years have been a struggle, in a sense, for answering two questions. The first question is, how do we get growth? And the second question is, how do we make sure that when we do have growth, the benefits are widely shared, and particularly shared to people at the bottom to reduce poverty, or even people in the middle? So what I want to do is, with that frame, that those are the two big issues, first talk about the strategies for promoting growth as they've evolved over the past 25 years, and then talk about the second set of strategies, the strategies for ensuring that the benefits are widely shared. 50 years ago, the idea was actually a very simple one. The major thing that separated developed from less developed countries was a shortage of capital, a shortage of resources. And that's why the international community founded the World Bank. What does a bank do? It provides money. The view was that there was a shortage of capital and that you could create a global institution, an international institution called the World Bank, that would transfer money or lend money at relatively low interest rates to developing countries, and that would enable them to grow. And the bank had some very interesting projects, some successes, but in the end, it didn't accomplish what was in hope for it. It didn't transform these economies. It didn't lead to rapid economic growth in most of the countries in which it was engaged. And not surprisingly, the search was on for alternative strategies. The next idea that came up after focus on transfer of capital and development projects was policies. Policies matter. But the particular policies that we're focused on were based on a particular set of ideas about what makes for good economics. And the particular focus was on efficiency and resource utilization and a particular model, which is called the neoclassical model of resource deployment. It was a very peculiar model, although understandable at the time. It was a model that was based on perfect information. It ignored the problems of, happens to be a topic that I feel very close to, but it ignored some of the real world characteristics of why in no country are markets well described by the assumptions of perfect competition, perfect information, perfect markets. It swept all that away and said, if only we had perfect markets, these countries their problems would be solved. So you had a group of economists march in to these countries and with a very simple set of doctrines. Now, what was wonderful about this particular approach is you didn't have to know much about the economy. All you had to do is to have an elementary course in price theory, and you could become a development specialist. So you would fly in and you would tell them a couple of simple messages. The basic message was, get prices right. And that usually meant liberalize, get rid of government regulations, like regulations in financial markets, and privatize. Government was really the source of the problem. And within macro, the only role for government was a very limited role, and that was avoiding inflation. Macro policy got translated into macro stability. Macro stability got translated into price stability. The belief was that if we just got the government out of the way, ensured stable prices, get prices right, then that was necessary and essentially sufficient for economic growth. Well, not surprisingly, those ideas didn't work in developing countries, and they haven't worked in developed countries. That led, the question is, why didn't these policies work? As an aside, if you look around the world today, the countries that did succeed in East Asia, they didn't follow these policies. Well, that suggests that while policies matter, if you tell countries to follow the wrong policies, you're not going to have success. So the fundamental problem was that they were pushing policies that I think in many respects they were not the right policies. Now, they often had a grain of truth in them, and that's what was so difficult. Countries that had rampant inflation did get into trouble. So talking about inflation did make sense. But inflation by itself is not the only problem. And so one of the difficulties, the IMF and to some extent the World Bank pushed these policies of stability, price stability, that undermined growth. So it wasn't just that they ignored growth, they actually pushed policies that impaired growth. Well, one of the reasons that these policies weren't the right policies was that the underlying assumptions of perfect markets, if you just got the government out of the way, you would have perfect markets that ignoring problems of imperfect information, imperfections of competition. That model was fundamentally flawed. And in advanced industrial countries, we have a whole variety of institutions that are directed to these market failures. We know about these market failures. Adam Smith knew about market failures. He talked about the dangers of monopoly, and that's why we have antitrust laws. In the aftermath of the Great Depression, the United States looked at what were the sources of the problems that had led to the Great Depression. And one of the problems was misbehavior by the financial system. And the result, there was an investigation, and the result of this was a passage of a number of laws, Glass-Steagall Act, Securities and Exchange Commission, that actually worked. In fact, they worked so well that the only period in the history of capitalism in which there has not been repeated financial crises were the 4 decades after the passage of these laws. But the irony was, the problem was that they worked so well that many people came to the belief that because we hadn't had any crises, we didn't need the rules, we didn't need the regulations. But of course, the reason we hadn't had the crisis was because we had the regulations. And so you had ideologues like Reagan and Thatcher in the UK that argued for the taking away of these regulations. And the consequences were predictable. In the 30 years after we began stripping away the financial sector regulation, we've had more than 120 financial crises all around the world. Most of them were in the developing countries. But in the advanced industrial countries, we had a few. Scandinavia had a number. United States had an S&L crisis. But then America always does things bigger and better than anybody else, and our crisis of 2008 really is, if you say, the mother of all crises. We did it better than anybody else. So, but these were the predictable and predicted consequences of stripping away these financial regulations. So part of the problem was that they did not fully understand the fact that markets by themselves are marked by a whole variety of market failures. And a standard part now of teaching in at least good universities, and I assume colleges, I assume Williams is one of those, is a discussion of these market failures and the mechanisms by which government can help correct them. As an aside, governments are not perfect. Sometimes people say, well, in criticism of some of my talk, they say you emphasize market failures too much. What about government failures? You never talk about that. And when I'm abroad, particularly, I say, anybody who's lived through the United States and the Bush administration knows about government failure. So we all understand government failure, but we also understand that there are ways of improving government. And there are ways, and I'll come back to that later, that there are incentive structures, there are institutional structures that help alleviate. You're never going to get perfect government, but you can reduce the magnitude of those failures, and you have systems of checks and balances. One of the arguments that one of the problems, though, is not just that they ignored these market failures. Efficiency in resource utilization is not the only issue, at least efficiency in static resource allocation is not the only issue in development. Because development entails a transformation, a dynamic process, a transformation of the economy. And this approach that focused on the static allocation of resources, the efficiency at a moment of time, was really a short-run focus. And I'll come back to that. That's a really very important flaw in this particular approach. Well, the other reason, the justification that some of the advocates of these sometimes called neoliberal Washington consensus policies, when it was evident that they had not worked very well, they said the problem wasn't with the policies, but with the way they were implemented. And that was in some sense true. But policies have to be designed to be implemented by mortal institutions. If it is the case that every time a policy is implemented, it's implemented badly, the implication is that actually is not a good policy because it was not designed to be implemented by the kinds of institutions that we have in developing countries or in developed countries. So an example of that kind of flaw were the privatization measures, the process of turning over government enterprises to the private sector. Many of the World Bank and IMF economists' argument for privatization would often begin by the statement that governments are corrupt, and you have to stop this corruption by taking away business enterprises, take them out of the government hands. But who is going to engage in the transfer of assets from the government to the private sector? Government. So actually, if you think about it, if you think government is corrupt, why should you be surprised when they make the transfer that they aren't corrupt? In fact, I sometimes jokingly say that when the IMF and World Bank economists would fly into a country and preach the notion of privatization, every once in a while you'd see the light bulb shine in the eyes of some corrupt government politician and say, what a wonderful idea. Before, I could only steal the revenues this year, but you taught me how to steal the present discounted value of all future revenues, the value of the assets. And that really transformed development. And so you had this process that wasn't called, that rather than, I call it briberization rather than privatization. And you had the accumulation in private hands of the large amounts of wealth. And often the privatization was done into a monopoly. And the monopoly was much better, the private monopoly was better at exploiting consumers than the government was. Government had a check of accountability, the private sector had no check. So this process of privatization, or briberization, actually interfered with economic efficiency. And as you may know, telephone rates in the country that borders us on the south are about 10 times that of the United States because of a monopoly that was created in the process of privatization. I won't say anything else about it. Well, after this agenda of focus on policies, it was clear that the first agenda didn't work, the agenda that focused just on capital, the second agenda focusing on policies didn't work, came the third agenda, and that was institutions. Institutions are important, and here, in a sense, the intellectual godfather perhaps is Doug North. His early work focused on the fact that institutions help fill gaps in markets. You know, one of the questions that the advocates of markets had to face was, why do we need institutions? After all, if markets are the wonder, why do we have these things called institutions? Well, they finally admitted that markets didn't cover everything. There were problems, there were absences, gaps in markets, and their answer was, well, when we have these gaps, institutions help complete the markets. And so they were efficiency enhancing, and that led to a prescription of let's have good institutions to complete the markets, and then this combination of good institutions and the wonders of the market would lead to the successes that everybody hoped for. But then people began to realize, and even Doug North came to this realization, is that some institutions actually are bad. Institutions are not just there to fill in holes. There are institutions, the definition of institutions is a little bit vague, but institutions are any sets of rules that, they're not just organizations, but a set of rules that govern society. And so among the institutions are institutions like those that maintain inequalities, institutions like caste systems, Jim Crow in the United States. Those are institutions. And none of us would say those institutions are good things. They're institutions that actually impede development. They are institutions that maintain inequalities and maintain power. And that led to a broad issue, two broad questions. How do we tell what are good institutions from bad institutions? And how do we create good institutions and get rid of bad institutions? And those two questions are very difficult, and I don't think anybody at this point has good answers to those questions. Now, for a while, the way it was put is, well, we can't define a good institution, but when you look at it, you can tell it. And we can't be sure what a bad institution, but when you see it, you know it. Now, how many people here think the Fed is a good institution? The Federal Reserve Board? Well, you don't have to raise your hands because many of you are visitors to the United States. You will feel embarrassed, but I can tell you the answer. Before the crisis, most Americans would have said Federal Reserve is a good institution, it's a meritocratic institution, good people. I don't think many people today say that the Federal Reserve is a good institution. It clearly, if you're judging by performance, it was a dismal institution. If you look at what happened to it, I think you'd have to say it was captured by those it was supposed to regulate. It was captured by the banks that were supposed to regulate. So in terms of output, in terms of performance, you have to say it was a very poor institution, and that there are central banks in, say, India that perform far better and were better institutions. But as Americans looked more closely at the Fed, this institution that they had taken as almost sacrosanct, as one, Greenspan was the maestro, what they realized is you took a closer look and you saw the governance and accountability of the Fed was an embarrassment. I don't know how many of you know how the president of the New York Federal Reserve Board is chosen. This is the bank that was responsible. The Federal Reserve, you have the regional banks, and they're supposed to oversee what goes on in their region. The Federal Reserve Board, the chairman, the president of the New York Federal Reserve Board, was one of the key players for the enormously expensive bailout of Citibank and AIG. Well, guess who was on the committee of 5 who chose the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of New York? The chairman of AIG and Citibank. If you look at how there's no democratic accountability, it doesn't go through Congress. No report to the citizens of where the money is spent, no legislative oversight, or actually say limited legislative oversight, there's some, but very limited. Now, at times, the institution has behaved well. They've had chairmen of the Federal Reserve that understand their sense of accountability, but it was individuals, not the institution. Paul Volcker, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve in the 80s, once put it very clearly, Congress created us and Congress can uncreate us. So he said, yes, we're independent, but we are politically responsible. But in other countries and other chairmen have not taken that view. They said, independence is sacrosanct. If you tell us to do something, we'll do the opposite, because it's not the right for citizens to tell us how to conduct monetary policy. Well, the point I want to raise is a very simple one. What I've just said is in economic circles almost heresy, because the principle that there ought to be an independent central bank is something that if you don't believe, you will lose your union card. But what I want to say, what I want to emphasize is it's a institutional feature that I think ought to be questioned. Not clear that it, or in fact, pretty clear that it didn't work well, and the fact that in spite of the failures, that in the bill that was just passed in Congress in regulation, give a failed institution more power certainly raises questions about the institutional structures in the United States. Well, if we don't even know what a good institution is, it's obviously even more difficult to know how to create them. But the good thing that come out of this discussion of institutions is that it recognized the importance of government. It recognized the importance that there has been no successful country that has developed in which government has not played an important role. And if government is going to perform those roles, you have to pay attention to the institutions of government, governance, corruption, and one has to understand that there has to be a balance between the government, the state, the private sector, and the third sector, the NGO and the civil society. So that, I think, has been one of the most important advances in thinking in development in the last 50 years. Coming back from, in the early days, a real focus, government planning, a lot of focus on government, and then we swung all the way to the other side, that get government out of the way. And now we've, I think, achieved a better sense of balance that one needs government, one needs markets, and one needs to figure out how to get those two to work together, each being in some sense a check on the other, and that we need to improve government, but we also need to improve markets. Well, the final set of perspectives that I want to focus on, and one I think that is just beginning to develop in the last maybe decade, is that the focus one of my criticisms of the focus of the policies of the Washington Consensus, the neoliberal policies, was that they took a very static view. They looked only at the allocation of resources today. But development is about transformation. It's about change. How can you focus on static resource allocation when your object is to try to transform societies and try to grow the economy? In a way, one way of thinking about this goes back to an article that was written by one of my teachers shortly before CDE was founded. In 1957, Bob Solow wrote a paper on the sources of economic growth, in which he argued that some 87% or so of all growth is related to technical change, and wasn't related to accumulation of capital, wasn't related to increases in the efficiency of the economy. It was related to technical progress. Schumpeter, even before that, had emphasized the importance of technical progress. About the same time that the CDE was founded in 1962, Ken Arrow, one of the great thinkers in economics of the 20th century, started analyzing how societies learn, how they improve how does technical change occur, both through research and through learning by doing. And that leads to a very different view of what is required to succeed in development. The perspective is that what separates developing countries from developed countries is not just a gap in resources, but a gap in knowledge. And this was really a view that the World Bank began to take when I was chief economist. The World Development Report of 1998 emphasized the importance of knowledge in development, creating knowledge institutions, and not just primary education, but also universities, institutions that can help absorb knowledge and transfer the knowledge from the more advanced industrial countries to the developing countries. Well, if you see that as the major focal point of successful development and transformation, then the focus of attention becomes, how do we create a learning society? What kinds of policies are going to facilitate this kind of transfer of knowledge and the ability to learn? So you have to learn. The fact that policies which are promoting learning and dynamic success may be very different from the policies which promote static efficiencies should be clear to all of us. Most countries, the United States, have laws called patent laws. Patent laws are laws that intellectual property rights have the effect of interfering with efficiency in a static sense. Knowledge is a public good. That is to say, if an extra person uses knowledge, a piece of knowledge, it doesn't cost anything. Economists refer to this, say knowledge is a pure public good. But our third president, Thomas Jefferson, put it much more poetically when he said, knowledge is like a candle. When one candle lights another, it doesn't diminish from the light of the first candle. That, of course, is really the philosophy of any educational institution. Well, the economic implication of this is that knowledge ought to be freely disseminated. But patent laws stop that. In fact, patent laws are even worse than that, because patent laws help create monopolies, even if they're temporary monopolies. So you ask the question, why does the Constitution of the United States and the laws of many other countries encourage these patents which interfere with the efficiency, the static efficiency of the economy? And the answer is be the belief, not always true, but the belief that in doing that, they are promoting innovation. They're promoting dynamic efficiency. So there's a trade-off between static efficiency on the one hand and dynamic efficiency on the other. And that's true in the context of developing countries. They may take actions which interfere with static efficiency, which was the only focus of the Washington Consensus policies, in order to achieve dynamic efficiency. When the World Bank and the IMF marched into a country like Korea in the early 60s, they said, you have a comparative advantage in growing rice, so you should become rice farmers. And the response in Korea was, no thank you. Even if we succeed, if we become rice farmers, we will become the best rice farmers in the world. But being the best rice farmers in the world, we will still not be a developed country. We will not be a member of the OECD. We will not be a high-income country. So they decided to put aside static comparative advantage in search for dynamic comparative advantage, for dynamic learning. And so they embarked on this remarkable strategy that led to, in a short span of 30 years, an 8-fold increase in their per capita income. Now, they didn't articulate it in quite the way that I'm about to articulate it, but what they effectively were saying is there are some sectors that are better at learning. Agriculture, and there are a whole set of reasons that my colleague Bruce Greenwald and I have been articulating. There are some sectors that are not very good for absorbing knowledge, and other sectors that are very good. Industrial sectors happen to be a way of learning, a sector in which learning can occur, but once that learning occurs in particular sectors, it can flow out in other sectors. The basic notion is that whenever there is learning, there are market failures, there are externalities, people benefit, the knowledge spills over. And so the fundamental model that was the basis of the Washington Consensus was flawed because it was entirely a static model. It's flawed in any context, but when you're talking about a dynamic transformation in the development process, it's particularly inappropriate. And so the core is, as I say, the core question in my mind in development strategies today is how do we reduce the gap in knowledge? How do we create learning societies? Well, there are many aspects of policy. In fact, this perspective affects almost every aspect of society. And if you look at the successful countries like Korea and like China, they were implicitly creating these learning institutions, or the policies that promoted learning. So they had very strong support for education, including institutions of higher learning. They had explicit policies for the transfer of technology. When they brought in foreign investment, they didn't just say, come in and take out our resources and enjoy give us a few bribes and we'll be content. When Malaysia invited the oil companies in, it said, we want you to come in, but if you're going to come in, you have to transfer to us the technology so that we will be an independent oil producer, not dependent on you in the future. And so today, Petrobras, Malaysia's oil company, is a global company. It's investing in other countries. Malaysia doesn't have to have foreign oil companies today. Malaysia is actually become is doing investment abroad. And the same thing in Brazil. Brazil is the leading oil in very deep water drilling. So these countries recognize that if you have foreign investors come in, you just can't have them come in. You have to figure out how are you going to learn from their investments. And that was one of the reasons why China, for instance, when they had foreign companies come in, insisted that they be joint ventures so that they could learn from these processes. So it affects investment policy, it affects technology policy, it affects education policy. So that, I think, to me, is the bottom line on where we are today. I think we've learned a great deal about how to promote growth. We've gone through a lot of failed strategies. I think, hopefully, we've now come on a set of strategies that have proven successful in East Asia and a number of other parts of the world, and are bringing unprecedented growth to those countries. That brings me now to the second part of the talk. I'll be a little bit quicker on that, and that is, how do we make sure that the benefits of growth are widely shared, and in particular, shared with the people at the bottom? As I mentioned before, trickle-down economics doesn't work. Growth doesn't necessarily benefit everybody. Expression was one time, a rising tide lifts all boats. Just not true. The problem is that not only is growth often not pro-poor, many of the growth policies are anti-poor. And many of the growth policies that have been advocated by some of the international institutions in the past have actually been adverse to the interest of the poor. I should say that, when I talk about the World Bank and the IMF, there have been very dramatic changes in both institutions. In the IMF, particularly in Dominique Strauss-Kahn has been the head. It's really been a very changed institution. And the World Bank changed very dramatically under Jim Wolfensohn, a lot of backsliding under Wolfowitz, and it's still much better than it was in earlier days. So the question is just to what are the lessons that we've learned? When is growth anti-poor? Well, there are a couple characteristics, two that I want to emphasize. Growth is anti-poor when it's accompanied by high unemployment. It should be obvious when people are unemployed, their income is low. And unfortunately, many of the policies that were pursued in the past led to high levels of unemployment. And the second thing is, growth is anti-poor when it's associated with high levels of real instability. And of course, those 2 points are related. The obvious example is one that the world is now worrying about right now. When capital flows, short-term capital flows into a country very rapidly and then flows out very rapidly, it creates a lot of instability. Short-term capital doesn't create jobs. You can't build factories, create employment and money that can go in and out in a few hours or a few days or a few weeks. So it doesn't create employment. But when exchange rates vary, when the economy is subjected to this kind of havoc, what happens is you have businesses go bankrupt, jobs get destroyed. When I had the big fight with the IMF back in 1997, one of the issues was I thought that they were engaged in excessively contractionary policies. As Gary mentioned, just the opposite of policies that we in the United States are doing today. The IMF came in and U.S. Treasury played a role in this, some of the same people that are on the scene today, but they demanded these countries raise their interest rate, cut back spending. So they had tight monetary policy and tight fiscal policy. And when I say tight monetary policy, they came into Korea, and first they told Korea to raise the interest rate to 25%, and then when they raised it to 25%, they said, oh, you have to be really serious. You have to raise it to 40%. Guess what happens when you raise interest rates to 40%? A lot of firms go bankrupt, about 50%. In the case of Indonesia, Indonesia had more experience with the IMF, and so they thought they would take a preemptive measure. That before the IMF came in, they raised the interest rates to 25%. The IMF said, oh, that's not good enough, you have to raise it to 80%. Well, they succeeded in getting bankruptcy of 75%. And unemployment in Java got up to 40%. So as we think about our unemployment, you should just think we should take our blessing that some of the people who are in Washington that got unemployment in Indonesia up to 40% have not succeeded in doing that here at home. When you have these policy, so part of my debate with them, I said, look, it's pretty clear. Standard economics, this is not, rocket science, says that they're facing, the data was so clear, they're facing this tremendous economic downturn. You're going to kill the economy, you're going to kill jobs, you're going to kill growth. And they said, don't worry. When we see evidence that the economy is dying, we'll lower interest rates. And I tried to explain to them that when you lower interest rates, you don't unbankrupt firms that are bankrupt. Once you're dead, you don't come to life again when interest rates get lower. They never got that point. Maybe they hadn't taken those physics courses where you learned about hysteresis. And I tried to explain that to them, but it never worked. The fundamental point is that if you have this instability, if you destroy jobs and you haven't created financial institutions that help lend to create new jobs, to help create new enterprises, you're going to have a problem. And the unemployment can be persistent, and the longer it is, it's harder to get down. So those are examples of policies that are anti-poor, and unfortunately, the policies of liberalization that I described before resulted in this high level of instability. The policies of tight monetary policy without thinking about how you get credit out to small and medium-sized enterprises meant that there was not the flow of credit to create new enterprises when you destroyed an old enterprise. So these were both policies which were very good at job destruction, but not very good at job creation. And the result of this is that these were policies that were very strongly anti-poor. Well, the good news again is that in the last 10 years, we've made actually a lot of progress in thinking about developmental innovations to try to make growth more pro-poor. We know how to make it, we know about some of the ingredients that have been anti-poor, but we've also begun to think a little bit more about how to be proactive in addressing problems of poverty. And a whole set of innovations that are now taught as part of standard courses in development, things like conditional cash transfers, microcredits, little innovations like improved cooking stoves, which have a very large impact on the health, climate change, the environment, burdens on women in gathering wood. We have things about social forestry, oral rehydration therapy. What is interesting about many of these innovations is that they are broad-based. They touch on a number of issues. Take microcredit. When it's successful, it's more than just finance. It's more than just a transfer of cash. And unfortunately, some of the enthusiasm of expansion of microcredit have lost that basic message. The problem is when it's just cash, consumer loans can lead individuals to be more indebted, and they're, in the long run, poorer. Most of the successful programs like the BRAC and Grameen Bank in Bangladesh have had a broader development agenda, including the promotion of social capital. And interestingly, there are two alternative approaches to try to getting credit out One is this social capital-based microcredit. The other one is the DeSoto-based system of property rights. And there's really no contest. In general, in the developing countries, the DeSoto approach has been much less successful than the microcredit approach. Well, I want to conclude, I've talked a little bit too long, with two general remarks. The first has to do with the measurement of success, measurement of growth, measurement of poverty. And this relates to what Jerry referred to. I chaired an International Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress. And one of the things that we emphasized in that report was that GDP provides a really relatively bad measure of performance. And unfortunately, it has been the basis of a lot of work on what is good policy. So if you're measuring success wrong, the inferences you make about what is good for success are going to be wrong. This was an idea that was in some sense actually work at the World Bank when I was there, and the World Development Report of 2000-2001 emphasized that what is important for well-being is not just income, but other issues, insecurity, and voice. We actually, just as a little aside, we had a very big fight with the U.S. Treasury. A particular person who was at that time Secretary of Treasury did not want us to talk about either insecurity or voice, or these other dimensions of poverty, because that raised broader social issues that he thought, broader questions about development policies. Well, the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Progress, Social Progress, has a central message, which is measurement matters. And that one of the points I've already made is increases in GDP per capita do not tell you how well most citizens of the country are doing. Per capita income in the United States has been going up almost every year except for last year. But in many years, and I'm looking over a 12-year period, the income of most citizens in the United States have been going down. That is not, I think, a economy that is performing well for most of its citizens. As I said before, income is not the only factor contributing to well-being. Bob Putnam has emphasized the importance of social connectedness. Other work has emphasized the importance of having a job. It's not just the income that the job generates, but making a contribution to our society. But in addition to that, there are many problems in the measurement of income. For instance, GDP does not measure the income of citizens in the country. And this, for many developing countries, is very important. And it's ironic that just as globalization took off, we switched from a measure of the, income of citizens in a country, which is GNP, to the income produced in a country, GDP. And those two numbers differ because of globalization. So let me give you an example. If a country like Papua New Guinea has a gold mine exploited by a mining company from a neighboring country, advanced industrial country, with most of the profits going to that other country, very small royalties going to Papua New Guinea, but the gold mine leaves a legacy of environmental and health problems. Actually, Papua New Guinea could actually be poor. The citizens of the country don't even get enough income to offset the value of the environmental degradation and the health hazards that are presented. And yet, GDP goes up a lot because GDP includes all the royalties that get paid out to Australia, to mention a country. The point I want to make is this is just one of many examples of problems, the measurement why GDP is not a good measure. The final thing that our commission emphasized was the importance of sustainability, that you need to take into account resource depletion, the depletion of natural resources, and degradation of the environment. In a way, we just say, these are not small measures, small problems. In the year 1999, the IMF paraded Menem, the president of Argentina, in front of the IMF meeting in Washington, saying, here is the example that you should all follow. And the reason was it looked like Argentina was growing very well. Its GDP was going very well. But all of us who knew what was going on in Argentina knew that that was not true, because its growth was a consumption-based growth based on borrowing. Is that a familiar ring? And that consumption-based growth was not sustainable. And as my predecessor at the Council of Economic Advisors, one of my predecessors at the Council of Economic Advisors once said, that which is not sustainable won't be sustained. And it wasn't sustained in Argentina, and it wasn't sustained elsewhere. So the point is that these are not small measures, small problems, that the GDP is not in many circumstances, not a good measure of well-being. And if you make inferences about what are good policies, what you ought to be doing for development based on false measures, you're going to make bad inferences, and the policies you shape on the basis may be very misleading. So the second general remark I want to make in conclusion is recognizing the right policies is not enough. For instance, take the case of financial reforms in advanced industrial countries like the United States. I think, at least among the economics profession, there is broad agreement about what the right policies were, what should have been done, and what should be done now. But the political power of the large banks stymied effective reform. And these same powers are likely to play an important role in international financial institutions, probably are going to stymie reforms that would undermine their political power. So the lesson of this is that an obvious point, but one that we sometimes forget, interest and politics are critical. But I want to conclude by saying ideas matter too. Ideas about how to promote growth and reduce poverty have played an important role in shaping policies. And that's been true even when these ideas were wrong or incomplete. I think the silver lining on the cloud of this global recession is that it's going to provide new perspectives, new thinking on economic policies, and it offers a rare opportunity for reshaping the policies. It gives us an opportunity to look back over 50 years of development thinking and realize that there have been some countries that have actually been pursuing some of the right policies for a quarter century and have succeeded in growth, stability, and reducing poverty. And perhaps it's time for those of us in the advanced industrial countries to study a little bit more what is happening in these successful developing countries. Thank you.
Okay, Joe has agreed to take some questions, so we have some time. I'd like to ask you to please state your name and also to please keep your question to a brief question.
Jerry, you're going to call? Yeah.
Is that a question?
Colin, here. I wondered if you could comment on the effect historically of the reliance on models rather than on real-world data, what that effect has been on development.
Could everybody hear the question? No. Okay. The question was about what has been the effect of the reliance on models rather than real-world data. And that's actually a complicated question because one of the problems is that data doesn't speak by itself. People always quote data to support their view. They always interpret the data, they select data. But one of the problems is that in the economics profession, over the last 25 years particularly, that the lens through which people have looked at data has been extraordinarily narrow, very circumscribed, and that has really put blinders around. The way I would say it is that they've ignored looking at a broader range of phenomena, looking at economic history, experience, and it's put such strong blinders that they've almost ignored reality. I mean, let me give you a couple of examples. Let me give one drawn from more recent United States experience. It became a mantra in the United States among people in the financial markets to say that the financial innovations were transforming the economy. And you could write down some models of financial innovations that improve the efficiency with which risk was handled. But if you look for data, there was absolutely no data to support this. No, and if you started looking more closely what was going on, it was pretty clear that when people were taking out $50, $60 billion of credit default swaps and derivatives, it wasn't just managing risk. You couldn't find what the risk they were managing. It was pretty clear they were creating risk. And I think this is an example where Paul Volcker put it very clearly at the end of all the debacle. He said he hadn't seen a single financial innovation that had improved the efficiency of the American economy other than the ATM machine. And he was right, except for one thing. The ATM machine was not an American innovation. It came out of the UK. So that's an example where people's models, the way they saw the world, overwhelmed the evidence. And that was true of most of the elements of the Washington Consensus. They felt it had to be the case that improving efficiency of the economy through the set of policies that I described had to lead to greater growth. And if it didn't, what was the conclusion? The policies hadn't been implemented the right way. And so it was such a strong doctrine that it became really a religion. There was almost no evidence that they could take on board that would refute their hypothesis. I used to challenge them. Is there any way that I can, any piece of evidence that would lead you to change your views? And almost in effect, the answer was no. And that's a mark of a religion as opposed to economic science.
Other questions, yes.
My name is Wei Sun, and you just mentioned that there is a different way of viewing the world. One is static view, and the other is dynamic view. So I wonder, like in a static point of view, all representative countries, there should be no trade surplus for any country. But if we take the dynamics into consideration, will that, and also the homogeneity out, so will that give kind of a different conclusion concerning trade surplus?
Very much so. I've actually written a paper I gave at the annual bank conference in development economics in Stockholm in June on exactly that point. The point is, what I argued is that assume that there is more learning associated with the export sector, the industrial sector, then there's one more condition that you need. If you can't use other instruments of policy, like industrial policies to promote that sector, and the only instrument you have is the exchange rate, then you will want to set the exchange rate to promote the industrial sector, the export sector, and you want to do it enough that you can have a trade surplus. And the interesting thing is you can show that it will be beneficial for you to do that even if you never cash in that trade surplus, even if you hold those reserves forever. So another way of putting it is China may have been better off even if the United States then says, I'm sorry, those bonds that you own are worthless. The fact is that China has succeeded already in transforming its society and its development, increasing its per capita income. And if that $2 trillion in reserves happened to all of a sudden disappear, they still would have been better off for that policy. Not everybody agrees with this, by the way.
My name is Ashpal. I'm an alum. What do you think about the ideas coming from behavioral economics that says economic actors are not rational, but predictably, systematically irrational? Should that be incorporated into mainstream economics?
Yeah, very much so. That is another one of the many assumptions that go into the standard neoclassical model. When I said perfect markets, it's not only perfect information, it's strong assumptions of rationality. And again, one of the wonderful things about the Great Recession is that it provides us with lots of documentation of irrationality. Any student, anybody that says the markets are rational, I don't know where they've been for the last 5 years. Now, the point you made is actually the very important one, that it's not just that there is irrationality, but there's systematic patterns in those irrationalities. So it's subject to investigation by social scientists. Now, some of those are important for how individuals behave, but don't have systemic consequences for macro stability, for instance, and some do. So, for instance, just to give you one example that's very important for many individual behavior is that what they've discovered is if you give people a choice when they take a job of do you want to take off 5%, 10%, or 15% of your salary and put it in a retirement account, if you say we're going to take out 10% unless you check 5 or 15, they'll always check 10. If you put, we'll take out 5 unless you check 10 or 15, they'll choose 5. If you put 15, unless you say, whatever you tell them, disproportionately, people will choose whatever you suggest. No extra work in making that extra check. I mean, this is not sweat. This is all based on there's a whole theory of how you frame things and defaults, and it's very important for policy. It really shows examples. So that's very important for savings behavior. And if government wants to encourage more savings, this is a mechanism by which they can succeed in doing so. Behavioral economics, however, hasn't been quite as successful so far in giving us insights into how do we deal with certain macroeconomic problems. It explains how people can exploit other people very well, but it doesn't give us yet a good grasp, I think, on how to manage the macroeconomy. Let me give you just one other story on this about where behavioral economics led to the wrong conclusion. There was a very interesting book written by a good friend of mine, George Akerlof, with Bob Schiller, on animal spirits that came out. And it really is based on behavioral economics. And it led, at least it's reported to have led some people in the Obama administration to say if they started last March talking about green shoots everybody would feel good. Because they felt good, they would all go spending more. Well, it didn't work. And it backfired because they talked about green shoots, and those green shoots turned brown by summer. It led them to a loss of confidence. So one has to be very careful about the use of behavioral economics.
Okay, let's go to the far side over there. Yes, please.
I am Fayad Hussain from Pakistan. I am currently a student. I just want to ask that until recently we have been taught by US and IMF and all these countries that yes, liberalize, bring your tariff, import tariff down, liberalize your exchange rate regime, and then make your capital account convertible. But now the things have changed. So when the US itself was in trouble, then the government came to rescue its banks and all those. So there was an intervention. So one thing is that after this crisis, this type of the thinking that liberalize everything, so is it going to change? And the other one is that when US government has come to rescue its big bank because they were too big to fail, so wouldn't it lead to moral hazard problem?
Yes. The last question is, will it lead to a moral hazard problem? Yes, and one of the criticism of the Dodd-Frank bill is they did nothing about the too big to fail banks. They did nothing really effective about this moral hazard problem. Let me make two general comments. One was brought out by the UN Commission on the reform of the financial monetary system, which I chaired, and Rob Johnson was on that, one of the commissioners. One of the points that we raised was that actually these bailouts really destroy the level playing field. Developing countries can't afford the kind of bailouts that the US government and some of the European governments did. And it's not just that Citibank now has an advantage because the US government really gave it a huge amount of money. Even if it paid it back, it was a critical help at a critical time. But there's another point. Because we haven't really addressed the problem of moral hazard, these firms, these banks, for instance, know that if they get into trouble, they'll be bailed out again. And that means they can take riskier action. So going forward, their behavior is affected. The playing field is no longer level between, it never was level, but now it's even more unlevel, more unfair to the developing countries. And the notion that subsidies are just as distorting as tariffs is well recognized. It's actually more unfair because any country can impose a tariff, but only rich countries can subsidize. So this is a kind of trade distortion that goes in only one way against developing countries. Now, what's been happening most recently is very interesting because U.S. monetary policy, quantitative easing, has been flooding the world with liquidity. And the government has really been intervening in the private market, as you said, in an unprecedented way. Many Americans don't really know that we no longer have a private mortgage market. The Federal Reserve is essentially buying all mortgages today. It now has $1.2 trillion of mortgages on its balance sheet. But this flood of liquidity is not leading to stronger lending in the United States. The money in a globalized economy looks all around the world for the best place to go, and the best place to go is increasingly in the emerging markets. So it's creating bubbles, exchange rate appreciation, and countries all over the world are responding in the only way that they can, which is to protect themselves. They went through what happens if you allow exchange rates to go up and then go down, capital flow in and then it'll flow out. That was the lesson of 97, 98. And they don't want to do that again. So what they're doing is intervening across a whole wide set of instruments, capital controls, banking regulations, taxes. Thailand just yesterday imposed a new set of taxes on the capital inflows, and exchange rate intervention. And the interesting thing is that without thinking about it, the United States is in the process of effectively changing the global financial regime. We're going, unilaterally, we moved us away from the Bretton Woods regime in the early 70s to a flexible exchange rate regime with open markets. We are now moving us, there's at least a substantial risk that the world will move to a world of fragmented capital markets, managed exchange rates, because you can let exchange rates be market determined in a stable environment, but if you have one country and the reserve currency country letting loose all of this liquidity, it destroys global stability.
Okay, we just have time for a couple more questions since there'll be a shot at Joe tomorrow, not literally. Ashok.
So, Ashok Rai, I teach economics here. So you've talked a lot about government failure and at least some government success. Do you have a theory of why some governments fail, others succeed?
Are there, what?
Why some governments fail and others succeed?
Oh, that's a hard question. Maybe I should say that's tomorrow. I think in a way, it's like the question, what makes good institutions and what makes bad institutions. I think a characteristic of good institutions, necessary, but I don't think sufficient, probably not neither. I take that back. What is so remarkable is you can see, and when you say good for what purposes? I think you meant economic management. But one of the characteristics of if I look around the world and say, what are the most successful advanced industrial countries in economic management, and using now the criteria that of the broader criteria, not just GDP, but the well-being of the citizens, it's the Scandinavian countries, markedly better in many dimensions. And they have a characteristic of a great deal of transparency. Sweden enacted its transparency laws, the right to know laws, equivalent of Freedom of Information Act, more than 200 years ago. So a long tradition of transparency and real attempts at social cohesion. Social cohesion is important because you have to make political compromises. And I think one of the problems one of the characteristics of unsuccessful is where you have a lot of conflict. When the conflict turns violent, then you almost always fail. But political gridlock is also a source of failure. So you look around many of the European countries where they've tried to have multiple channels of social consensus formation, social partners. Now, many of these are small countries, and it may be that you can bring social consensus in small units, achieve social consensus in smaller units better. But unfortunately, it's a great question, and we can maybe try to talk about it tomorrow.
Okay, one more.
I'm Stephen Webster. I am a senior here. You quote Solow and Schubert saying that growth is driven by productive knowledge. Now, a big chunk of my generation is unemployed and very skeptical of business, profits, and perhaps from an environmental viewpoint, technology. And I'm wondering, how can we get the chunk of my generation that is not as interested in that to get behind and get opportunities to create meaningful, productive knowledge that will drive growth? And is that a policy question?
Well, see, in a way, what you're really saying is that you and many people of your generation think that the kind of growth that we've had, which is very materialistic, more cars, bigger homes, is not a real good measure of well-being. And that's exactly what the Commission on the Measurement of Economic Performance and Social Progress said, that really we've been not looking at what it is that contributes to individual and societal well-being. One of the but whatever your view of what contributes to societal well-being, knowledge can be used to achieve that. So, one of the problems one of the problems in the current situation is we have very distorted prices. Just like before the crisis, the prices for real estate were distorted, the prices associated with finance were distorted, and our measure of GDP was very badly distorted. So prices of real estate were 30%, 40% too high. Profits, 40% of all profits were in the financial sector. We thought what should have been a means to an end became an end in itself. But we now realize that those profit numbers were just a mirage. They were just made up. And so our measure of GDP was wrong. Okay? So now what you're saying is actually that problem is broader. We treat the environment, we treat, for instance, air as if it's a free good, when in fact we know that there are high costs associated with using it. And if we correct that, we change the prices, we would get a different measure of GDP, a different output. Now, in a way, this is just the beginning of a statement about how we ought to rethink how we measure performance. So these are, even within the current framework, we're making very big mistakes, but there are broader failures about what we think of as a good society, as a measure of social progress, and some of the things that might get GDP up in the old way could actually be bad for well-being. And that was kind of what I mentioned Bob Putnam's work in social connectedness. So, but to go back to your question about technology and knowledge, whatever we decide as a society is our objective, knowledge is just a means to achieve that. We can do it better or worse. And so, we can. The whole point is to think about means and ends and make sure what we do enables us to get to the ends that we really care about. And the problem was that we didn't do that kind of analysis, and we raised certain things like the finance as if it were an end in itself, didn't ask what were the means that it was, what was the end that it was, should have been a means towards, and that led to all kinds of distortion. So what I hope is that people in your generation start rethinking these basic questions and ask, what are the things they care about, and how do we go about doing it? But just let me reiterate, in whatever we seek to do, having knowledge about how to do it better will be absolutely essential.
Okay.